Let's get more on this with Behnam Bentaleblu. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and joins us live from Washington, D.C. this morning. Behnam, thanks for your time. What's your understanding of the scale of this attack, the scope of the damage, and perhaps most importantly this morning, the risk of Iranian retaliation now?
Well, great to be with you, gentlemen, again. In essence, I think this is more of the same, which is a cyber-enabled shot across the bow. What's being reported in the press at the moment is that this basically took out the electricity. It's a blackout at really the heart of Iran's domestic uranium enrichment program, which is underground in central Iran at a plant called Natanz. This plant has been struck before. There was sabotage around it in the summer of 2020. And historically, I believe in 2010, there was the Stuxnet cyber virus. So this has been the focus point of intelligence agencies for quite some time now. And moving forward, I would expect these sites to feature more so as talks get underway, as the Israel-Iran shadow war potentially heats up, and of course, as the Iranians continue to violate that 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. It's telling that while we don't know the exact scale and scope, because the Iranians have an incentive to downplay any damage that could have been caused by this blackout, it's likely that they're going to continue to try to use these violations to garner leverage for their position over time. So when you mention a potential Iranian response, I think it's important to look at multiple domains. The Israel-Iran shadow war, for instance, happens in the cyber domain. It happens on land in Syria, occasionally in Iraq even, and it happens at sea with tankers. And of course, there's going to be politics involved.
Absolutely, and this comes at a very challenging time as well. We saw Iran celebrating its nuclear day just last week. Iran and world powers also resuming talks in Vienna this week aimed at restoring and bringing back the JCPOA. How do you think this attack is going to impact those talks laid down for this week?
So I actually see this attack as driven more by the Iranian nuclear day. Particularly on that day, there was talk of a new cascade of centrifuges. There was talk of installing more advanced centrifuges, which would again constitute violations of the deal, violations which, of course, Iran is trying to turn into leverage at those very negotiations that you mentioned in Vienna previously. I don't see the attacks as being an impediment to talks. If the Western coalition trying to get Iran back into compliance with the deal was smart, they could probably capitalize on the fact that these attacks have happened and say one way to stop these attacks is to come into compliance with your international obligations. I don't necessarily see that talking point being utilized. I also don't think politically that's where the West is. Again, most fingers in the media right now are pointing to Israel as being the source of this, not the United States. I would tend to agree with that assessment, though there's obviously no confirmation. But I think this will definitely drag out. You're likely to see the cyber war heat up between these two countries in the next few months, and you're likely to see more talk of talking in the next few months. And in the meantime, while there's more cyber attacks and there's more talking, you can almost guarantee that sites like Natanz will be doing everything they can to continue producing.
Well, that brings me to the next point. How quickly does the US really need to move on Iran? Because we know that President Biden has, of course, suggested that there will be a policy change from, of course, the Trump era.
Indeed. And in fact, you could see in the U.S. Biden getting pressure from his left flank for not moving fast enough. But at least on this issue, with all that Biden has on his plate, patience is indeed a virtue. In fact, the longer the U.S. retains those sanctions that it very much politically eschews on the books, the more likely it is to facilitate a change in Iran's position. Right now, it's been the U.S. that has at least rhetorically changed its position. Prior to the commencement of those exploratory indirect talks, we should say, in Vienna, the U.S. is talking about a stronger and longer deal and about having Iran come into compliance first before there was ever any potential sanctions relief. Those talking points seem to be dropped altogether, whereas the Iranians continue to insist that the U.S. needs sanctions relief up front. So if we had to liken this to a game, I'd say it's a game of nuclear chicken.
It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out because clearly the United States would like a deal done, but Iran also racing against time here, given that it has its own elections coming up in June. Behnam, the other interesting thing I wanted to talk about was what we're seeing out of Israel right now. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin touching down, of course, first Biden era official to visit Israel. Just your thoughts on his visit and what the Israelis would like to see from these talks between the Americans and the Iranians and world powers over the JCPOA.
Indeed, I think it's historic, and I think the Israelis want the U.S., not from a military perspective, but from a political perspective, to not make the same mistake, which is going into talks in 2012, 2013, the Western coalition, the P5+1, even you could say, had economic leverage given to them by many years of multilateral sanctions. Now the U.S. again has economic leverage given to it by 1.5, 2 years of unilateral sanctions under the Trump era. I think the Israelis don't want to see the U.S. junk it, either for political reasons or to try to rush to put a cap on Iran's nuclear program or to overread something about Iran's domestic politics. I think the Israelis want a genuine solution and not a kicking of the can down the road, which is likely, I think, what the secretary may have heard from the prime minister on that important historic trip. But I have to briefly comment on the Iranian domestic situation here. I think the U.S. should be cognizant of the upcoming changes with the June election, but don't be consumed by it. The Iranian system has been shifting to the right anyway for quite some time. It's likely that whoever wins, it's going to be a hardliner, and the U.S. needs to prepare for that. The best way to prepare is to not dispense with the leverage they've already been given due to the market forces like the US dollar and unilateral economic sanctions.